Thank you, Paula, for that wonderful introduction. And oh my goodness, thank all of you for being here. This is so exciting. I'm so excited about having my book translated into Portuguese, and so excited to be back at UERJ. This is not my first time here. I've been in this room before. It was 7 years ago for the World Public Health Nutrition Association meeting, and it's just very exciting to be back, and very exciting to be back in Brazil. I'm here to talk about this book, which has just been translated into Portuguese, and I want to thank the publisher, I want to thank Paula, and the translator who did a really wonderful job of translating it. I write books about food politics. This is a book about food politics. And I'm particularly excited to be in Brazil to talk about it and to have a Portuguese edition, because Brazil is ground zero for marketing of junk foods. You may remember this article in the New York Times that came out a year or so ago that talked about food industry marketing of foods in to particularly low-income people in Brazil. And of course, we know that what happens is that when people eat these foods, they eat more calories, they gain weight, and are more susceptible to chronic disease. I'm saying that because this is the work of a very important Brazilian nutrition professor, Carlos Monteiro, at the University of São Paulo, who has really set a world standard for talking about ultra-processed foods. This is a term that he invented that has now become worldwide. Everybody is using it, and people are doing very important experiments to demonstrate what happens when you eat ultra-processed foods. This is an experiment from probably the leading researcher on metabolism in the United States, Kevin Hall, who did a very carefully controlled clinical study to show what happened if people ate ultra-processed foods. And what he showed is that people who eat these foods eat a lot more calories than people who don't. The foods are designed to make you love them. We all love them. And they unfortunately make you eat more than you need. And that's where the weight gain comes from. And then I'm happy to be in Brazil at this particularly interesting political moment when there's a proposal to do front-of-package labeling in Brazil. And this is a study that came out very, very recently, within the last week or two, that looked at that did a comparative study of 3 different designs, and this one conveyed the message that it was high in salt, that the food was high in salt, better than any of the others. So I hope you get to have this. Good luck. And finally, the other reason, of course, is that Brazil sets the standard in world dietary guidelines. The Brazilian dietary guidelines that came out a couple of years ago talk about the need to link agricultural policy with nutrition policy, the need for sustainability, and how sustainability should be an integral part of dietary guidelines, and also that social justice should be included. I wish that the American guidelines could be like this. Very impressive. So thank you for doing all that. I talk about these issues from the standpoint of food systems. Food systems is the hot new term for linking agricultural policy to nutrition policy. Food systems refers to everything that happens to a food from the time it's produced until the time it's consumed and wasted. And what a food system approach insists on is that you not talk about any part of the food system without taking into consideration all of the other parts. Now, we are, in 2019, are dealing with 3 global public health problems that deal with nutrition. The first is food insecurity, hunger, and malnutrition, not enough food. The second is having too much food, too many calories, obesity, and its public health consequences. And the third is the effect of our food system, food production and consumption system on the environment. These are problems that affect everyone in the world. And in looking at them as a whole, colleagues and I have come to the conclusion that one of the key factors in causing these three worldwide problems is a food system that's driven to maximize profits, not one that's aimed at public health. And as I'm fond of saying, it's important to understand that food companies are not social service agencies, and they are not public health agencies. They are businesses whose job it is to produce profits for shareholders. That's what they're supposed to do. If their products are not good for public health, that is not relevant to the decisions about what business does, because that's how business works. And it's not that the people who work for food companies are evil or have bad ideas or want to make people sick. That's not what happens. Problems with public health are collateral damage from a food system that is focused on maximizing profits. So with that background, this is what I write about, and when I write about these things, I think I'm describing the obvious. I think this is so obvious that everybody should be doing it. But if I go on to the web and look for influences on individuals' food choices, I get diagrams like that one. And this diagram says that things like lifestyle and cost and religious and moral beliefs and regional variations and availability and cultural factors are what influence your choice of food. Nowhere in this do you see anything about food industry marketing. It's as if food industry marketing doesn't exist. It's as if you make your food choices, and the billions of dollars that the food industry is spending on trying to sell you certain kinds of foods doesn't even happen. They are doing such a good job of advertising that you don't even know you're being advertised to. Now, a great deal of research has focused on the effects of food industry marketing and the effects of food industry funding on research, on the outcome. And these studies have been done mainly for the cigarette industry, the chemical industry, and the pharmaceutical drug industry. And I'll just talk about the pharmaceutical drug industry because there's been so much research on it. And this research dates back to the 1970s, when public health people first started writing about how pharmaceutical industry funding of physicians and drug research influenced physicians' prescription habits and the outcome of that research. And this research, which there are just libraries full of books about this, and literally thousands of articles, comes to conclusions that I've summarized here. First of all, sponsored research tends to favor the sponsor's interests if it's a drug company. Second, big gifts have a bigger effect than small gifts. But even small gifts are enough to change a physician's prescription practices. Just a pen and a prescription pad with the name of a drug on it is enough to encourage that physician to prescribe that drug rather than a generic, or maybe even one that's more effective. The influence of the gifts turns out to be unconscious. People are not aware that they're being influenced. They did not intend to be influenced. They don't recognize the influence, and they deny it. They say, my science is science. The industry funding has nothing to do with how my study is designed. The justifications for taking industry funding are largely invalid, and I'm sure we'll talk more about that. And disclosure of industry funding is necessary, but it's not nearly enough to solve the problem of the conflicts of interest that occur. Now, when I switched to look at food industry funding of nutrition research, and I expected to see an enormous body of literature on this, I was actually able to find only 11 studies. I could count them almost on two hands. Between 2003 and 2018, researchers have looked at the influence of food industry funding on a variety of products, although most of the studies were done on sugary drinks. The effects on health, the health effects were different, the methods were different, and the outcomes were somewhat different. But in general, these 11 studies pretty much back up what has been seen for drug industry funded research. The results favor the sponsor's interest. Most of the problem occurs in the way the research question is designed or the way that the results are interpreted. So let me talk a little bit about this and about why I happened to write this book to begin with. One reason is that the way that the food industry works and the drug industry works is very much like the way the tobacco industry worked. When the tobacco industry realized that more and more research was coming out about how smoking cigarettes caused lung cancer, instead of stopping producing cigarettes, which would have been a really good idea, they embarked on an enormous public relations campaign to convince people that cigarettes didn't have anything to do with lung cancer. Instead, they blamed personal responsibility. It's your fault if you smoke. We're not holding a gun to your head forcing you to smoke a cigarette. They argued for self-regulation. They argued for public policies that would be in their interest. They lobbied behind the scenes, and they funded research to show that cigarettes didn't have anything to do with lung cancer or any other kind of cancer or heart disease or all the other problems. And the food industry is doing the same thing. What the food industry playbook is very similar to the tobacco industry's playbook. Now, when I talk about the food industry, I'm mainly talking about the multinational corporations that sell the food products that are absolutely everywhere in every store in Brazil that people really have come to love. They love the taste of them, love to buy them, love the way they crunch. We all love these products. And so why did I start writing about this? Well, I had several reasons for writing this book. First of all, I've been interested in the question of food industry funding and influence since the early 2000s. I wrote my first article about food industry sponsorship of nutrition research and professional activities in 2001. And I wrote that article because I was going to a lot of meetings about childhood obesity. And at those meetings, person after person would get up to speak and say, what are we going to do to teach mothers to feed their children better? That was the main thrust of those meetings. Never, not once in those days did I hear someone get up and say, how are we going to stop food companies from marketing directly to our children? Because that marketing was invisible. People just didn't see it or recognize it. So I wrote that first article to try to increase the recognition level. I incorporated that article into Food Politics, my book that came out in 2002, and then I kind of forgot about it. And I forgot about it until around 2015 when I was doing the research for my book, Soda Politics, which came out in 2015. And I started running across an enormous amount of research sponsored by Coca-Cola with results that came out exactly the way Coca-Cola would have wanted those studies to come out. And while I was at it, I also noticed that a lot of other companies, not just Coca-Cola, but other companies were funding research. And I got so annoyed by this because I could predict the results of the research by knowing who the funder was, and I could predict that it was industry-funded research by the title. I got pretty good at that. And I found that rather annoying. And so in March of 2015, I started posting. Every time I found 5 studies funded by industry, I would post them on my website. And I did that from March 2015 to March 2016. And at the end of that year, I had 168 studies that had been funded by food companies, and 156 of them came out with results that were favorable to the particular sponsor. Only 12 were unfavorable, even though I begged readers to find me industry-funded studies that had results that weren't favorable to the sponsor's interest. Now, this was not scientifically done. It was a convenience sample. It was just what I ran across. But it still had some interesting information that at least I think it's interesting. One was, I can't believe the list of food companies and food trade associations that are funding research these days. This is an enormous list, and this is only part of it. There are many, many, many more than that. Any unhealthy food that you can think of, any healthy food that you can think of, a trade association for it is sponsoring research to try to show that this food is a superfood and has some special effect. So let me give you an example of one. I have to say, I love mangoes. The mangoes in Brazil are wonderful. And here's a study that says that mangoes are better for relieving symptoms of constipation than equivalent amounts of fiber. I looked at the title of this and thought, who paid for this? Bingo, the National Mango Board. Big surprise. Remember, I told you these things are absolutely predictable. But here's one that's a little bit, that's a healthy food. Everybody would be healthier eating more mangoes. Mangoes are great. But how about this one? This is a study that shows that candy consumption is not associated with body weight, risk factors for cardiovascular disease, or diet quality in young children and adolescents. In other words, kids who eat candy are healthier than kids who don't. Isn't that terrific? Certainly the National Confectioners Association, which sponsored this study, thinks so, and this was so shocking that the Associated Press wrote an article about how candy makers shape nutrition science to demonstrate that eating candy is good for you. Isn't that good news? But the article that really got me started doing this book is a child of this particular article that came out in 2015 in the New York Times. It was a front page story on how Coca-Cola funds researchers who emphasize the importance of exercise over diet as a cause of obesity. And this article was so shocking that even Fox News was shocked. But I was quoted in the article saying something. I was quoted in the article saying, "Oh no, not again," or something equally rude. And I got called by probably 30 reporters in the week after this article came out. And the reporters were shocked. They could not believe that Coca-Cola would fund research demonstrating that exercise was more important than food in calorie balance and obesity. They could not believe that researchers at very respectable universities would take money from Coca-Cola for doing this. And they could not believe that the universities would accept money from Coca-Cola and let their faculty do this. Really? They knew nothing about how universities in the United States work. And in fact, if they found this shocking, they really didn't understand the whole system, and I had another book to write. So I got to work. But this article, the reporter for this article had obtained emails between Coca-Cola and the researchers who did the research. And these emails showed that Coca-Cola had set the research agenda, that it wrote the press releases, that it organized the investigators' presentations. In fact, it viewed the investigators as team members. It would address emails to the investigators as, "Hey, team." It pressured reporters, it spied on critics, and in some cases it did not allow research to be published if the results came out in ways that the company didn't like. That was in the New York Times article, but last week an article came out in the Journal of Public Health Policy that I'm showing you here, in which a group of investigators has documented these emails in this study. So if you want to read the emails, you can take a look at this study, because there they are. Now, Coca-Cola was very embarrassed by all of this publicity about its funding of research. And the head of Coca-Cola wrote an op-ed piece for the Wall Street Journal and said, "We're really embarrassed about this. This doesn't reflect our company. Our company is better than this. We're going to go completely transparent. We are going to post on our website the names of every single person that we give money to, and every single organization that we give money to, and the amounts of money that we give." And to my enormous surprise, they did. And they have kept it up, and they review it and update it every 6 months. And the most recent one, which was in December of last year, showed that between 2010 and 2018, Coca-Cola had spent $147 million on partnerships and research investigations. They don't specify how much for each one, but I'm guessing it's about half and half. So roughly half that much on research and half that much on partnerships. Well, transparency, which is really fun, and you should look and see whether Coca-Cola has done this for Brazil. It would be very interesting to find that out. You just Google Coca-Cola, transparency, Brazil, and see what comes up. But transparency allows analysis. And investigators at the University of California, San Francisco did one such analysis. They asked the question, do sugar-sweetened beverages have anything to do with obesity and type 2 diabetes? They found 60 studies examining that question. Of those studies, 26 concluded, no, sugar-sweetened beverages have nothing to do with obesity and diabetes, type 2 diabetes. What a coincidence. 25 of them were sponsored by industry. On the other hand, they found 34 studies that said, yes, sugary beverages have a great deal to do with obesity and type 2 diabetes, and only one of those was industry funded. And I'm willing to bet that the investigators in that study never got funded by a soda industry again. So Coca-Cola sponsored research. I pick on Coca-Cola because they went transparent, and so it makes it much easier to do this. But lots of other companies are doing this too. Their sponsored research was really focused on 3 goals: to demonstrate that any research that linked sugary beverages to obesity and type 2 diabetes was so flawed that you don't need to pay any attention to it, that the health risks of sugar and sugary beverages are enormously overstated, and that physical activity is more important than diet if you're worrying about your weight. All of these, of course, are false. Now, Coca-Cola isn't the only company doing this, and I was fascinated to see this article in an industry newsletter, NutraIngredients.com, which comes out of Great Britain and is industry sponsored, writing about the importance of food clinical trials, how companies are validating the health benefits of their products in order to increase sales. And the statement in this that just made me gasp was that Contract research organizations, which are groups of nutrition researchers who do this kind of research for food companies, they know how to design trials, look at statistics, and analyze data in ways that give their studies every chance of succeeding. These activities have a huge effect on the outcome of clinical trials. In other words, they know how to design a study to give you the exact result that you're looking for. Now, I have to say, it's not hard to do that. As someone who was trained in science, I was trained to look at every conceivable way in which my work could be biased and try to control for that, and do everything possible to make sure that those biases didn't get introduced. Lisa Biro, who's an investigator at the University of Sydney in Australia, and her group has an article that came out some weeks ago on the influence of industry sponsorship on the research agenda. And her research demonstrates that the place where the bias in studies is most prominent is in the way the research question is asked. It's also in the way it's reported. And there's a big difference between designing a research project to answer the question, what is the benefit of my product, and what is the effect of my product? Those are two completely different questions. Now, I get letters all the time from food trade associations saying, we have $50,000 and we're looking for research to demonstrate the benefits of our products. Here's one such letter from the Cherry Research Committee. Let me make it clear, I love cherries. And it said, the proposed research should document a direct relationship between the consumption of cherries and reduced risk, prevention, or improved treatment of disease. They're not going to fund open-ended studies that ask what the effect of eating cherries might be. They only want studies that are going to prove that eating cherries is beneficial, because they can then use that information in marketing campaigns. So that's the situation, and I think it's one that has consequences, and those consequences are fairly serious. There are scientific risks in that the research agenda becomes distorted, and dietary advice based on that research becomes distorted. There are also risks to researchers, and I was very interested to see this study come out, or this commentary come out in the BMJ, what used to be the British Medical Journal, just this week, or last week, in which the head of a health department in the United Kingdom wrote this very sad editorial about how she had once been an investigator on a study that was funded by Coca-Cola, and everybody has been very mean to her about it ever since. People have complained that they don't trust her work, that her work has sold out, that she's been sold out to industry, and she feels that she will never live down just the fact that she had industry funding, and she really can't understand what the problem was. I happen to be very familiar with the clinical trial that she was involved with, and it was a trial in which the investigators looked at the main causes of obesity in children throughout the world. And guess what? The most serious factor that predisposed children towards obesity was lack of physical activity. Diet didn't turn up at all. Of course diet didn't turn up. They didn't ask whether diet was involved. They didn't do this. They didn't design the study to find out whether diet was involved. She doesn't say that. The British Medical Journal does not allow authors of clinical editorials and education articles to have financial ties with industry. And there are public risks, and the public risks are endless confusion about what to eat and loss of trust in research, which I think is a very serious problem. Now, here's another example of exposure of people who take industry funding. This one happens to be drug industry funding, but it was a front page article in the New York Times where a vice president of Sloan Kettering Cancer Research Institute in New York City was found to have published many, many papers and neglected to mention many papers about the effects of drugs and whether drugs were effective or not, without mentioning that he had financial ties to the makers of that drug, and he was exposed as having financial connections to at least 30 drug companies. And as a reason, this was so embarrassing to Sloan Kettering that he had to resign. But don't worry about him. He was hired immediately by AstraZeneca, and I'm sure is doing just fine. And I say that because there are big debates in the nutrition literature about whether taking money from food companies is good, bad, or indifferent. There are people who write that any partnership between a health organization and the food industry risks derailing public health nutrition. That means completely undermining it and throwing it off the rails so that you have to ignore it. Whereas there are other researchers who argue that yes, we should welcome industry funding of public health research because industry has an interest in public health research. You can guess which side of the debate I'm on. And I'm particularly concerned because many of my nutrition colleagues believe that taking money from food companies is a really good idea. And I particularly like this study, or this commentary, which talks about white hat bias, that the presence in the public health community of activists who really want to make people healthy is a bias in itself. And this article argues that industry funding has no influence on science, that any criticism of industry funding is a personal attack, an ad hominem personal attack, that career goals, beliefs, and practices are just as biasing as industry funding, and that disclosure takes care of the conflicts. If you disclose that you have industry funding, that takes care of it. I think every single one of those statements is false, is incorrect. But let me say one thing about disclosure, because it's a big issue in nutrition research right now. There are a group of statisticians at Stanford University who have written a series of articles criticizing nutrition research in particular for methodology that is so poor that you need to ignore everything that it says. And in this particular article, they argue that nutrition researchers need to disclose their advocacy or activist work as well as their dietary preferences. In particular, if they're writing about diets such as the vegan, Atkins, gluten-free, high animal protein, or diets that involve supplements, they need to disclose that. So I had better disclose my dietary preferences right now. I am an omnivore. I've given here the thesaurus definition of omnivore: eater, consumer, glutton, gourmet, diner, epicure, devourer, gorger, bon vivant, gastronomer. I'm sorry, translator. That was hard. I apologize. And I don't take money directly from food companies. So that's my conflict of interest statement, but I take it seriously. Lisa Biro and her colleagues in Sydney argue that industry funding bias is very different from career or belief bias or dietary bias, because everybody who does research has dietary preferences. Everybody who does research has hypotheses that they want to prove, and everybody who does research has career objectives, but not everybody who does research has industry funding, and those kinds of biases are decidedly different, in part because the way the results almost invariably favor the sponsor's interest. So I was really happy in January when Lancet came out with its special issue on the global syndemic of obesity, undernutrition, and climate change, in which it took a food systems approach to policy, one diet, to prevent food insecurity, promote nutritional health, and prevent obesity, and protect the environment. And they had several recommendations for policies that would do that, but the one that got me most excited was the one to make big food companies pay for what they are doing to promote obesity and to promote climate change, as this one report picked up. The article, which is the strongest article in a major medical journal that I have ever seen, looking at the food industry. Remember, the food industry has been invisible up until very recently, but this committee looked at it, and they had several suggestions for avoiding the perhaps unconscious power of industry funding. If you want to avoid conflicts of interest, the easiest way is just not take the money. Avoid industry partnerships is their first piece of advice. If that's not possible, set firewalls. Don't let the industry funding have any influence whatsoever on the research question, the way the studies are designed, or anything else about it. Insist on investigator independence. Be vigilant about bias. Be skeptical of what the industry is doing, and by all means, and by all possible means, keep the industry out of setting dietary guidelines and keep the food companies out of setting dietary policy, because they will always want to set guidelines and set policy to promote their economic interests. That's their job, and they do it well. And as for individuals, as for the general public, before you read another health study, check to see who's funding the research. That won't guarantee that the research is skewed, but it will give you a good suggestion that it might be. And I will stop here at this point and give you my one word in Portuguese, obrigada.